"You clearly don't understand the science behind climate change," Justin Baldoni announced confidently to Thomas Massie during the panel. Massie's MIT electrical engineering degree destroyed Baldoni's credibility forever. This is the incredible story of how a Hollywood actor's environmental activism was completely dismantled by a real scientist, and why what happened that day changed how the entire entertainment industry thinks about expertise versus performance. It was the morning of December 3rd at the Global Climate Solutions Summit in Los Angeles. The most influential environmental activists, scientists, and policymakers had gathered at the prestigious Beverly Hills Conference Center for what was being called the most important climate discussion of the decade. Leonardo DiCaprio was there. Al Gore had flown in from Tennessee. Greta Thunberg sat in the front row next to representatives from the United Nations. But the real attention was focused on two very different types of environmental advocates who represented completely opposite approaches to climate action. Justin Baldoni, the 40-year-old actor and director who had built his reputation on socially conscious filmmaking and environmental activism. His movies like 5 Feet Apart and It Ends With Us had made him a Hollywood favorite, but it was his passionate advocacy for climate action that had made him a leading voice in the entertainment industry's environmental movement. He had been featured on every major talk show, interviewed by climate journalists, and praised by environmental organizations for using his platform to raise awareness about global warming. And then there was Thomas Massie, the 54-year-old congressman from Kentucky, who had somehow become one of the most misunderstood figures in American politics. To most people, especially in Hollywood, Massie was just another Republican politician who voted against environmental legislation and opposed green energy initiatives. The mainstream media had labeled him a climate denier, and environmental groups had targeted him as an enemy of progress. The contrast couldn't have been more dramatic. Baldoni represented everything that Hollywood activism was supposed to be: passionate, articulate, and committed to using entertainment to change hearts and minds about climate change. Massie represented everything that environmental activists despised: a conservative politician from a coal-producing state who consistently voted against their preferred policies. The tension had been building for months. Baldoni had frequently criticized politicians like Massie in interviews, suggesting that they were either scientifically illiterate or corrupted by fossil fuel money. He had used his social media platforms to attack climate deniers in Congress, often mentioning Massie by name as an example of what was wrong with American politics. Baldoni believed that people like Massie were literally destroying the planet through their ignorance and greed. Massie, for his part, had largely ignored the Hollywood criticism. He was used to being mischaracterized by activists who didn't understand his actual positions or his background. He had learned long ago that explaining nuanced policy positions to people who preferred simple narratives was often a waste of time, but he had agreed to participate in this panel because he believed that real solutions to climate challenges required actual scientific understanding, not just passionate rhetoric. The panel discussion was titled Science, Policy, and Action: Building Consensus for Climate Solutions, and everyone in the room knew this wasn't going to be a typical environmental conference. This was going to be a direct confrontation between Hollywood environmentalism and political pragmatism, between activist passion and policy realism, between performance and substance. The moderator was Anderson Cooper, a veteran journalist who had covered both entertainment and environmental issues extensively. He understood that this panel represented more than just a policy discussion. This was a clash between two completely different approaches to environmental advocacy, and two completely different definitions of what qualified someone to speak authoritatively about climate science. As the panel began, both participants looked confident in their respective approaches. Baldoni wore a perfectly tailored eco-friendly hemp suit, his appearance carefully calculated to demonstrate his commitment to sustainable fashion. His preparation team had spent weeks briefing him on climate statistics, scientific studies, and talking points designed to expose what they saw as Massie's fundamental ignorance about environmental science. Massie wore a simple navy suit, no eco-fashion statements, no virtue signaling through wardrobe choices, his appearance reflecting his focus on substance over symbolism. Those who knew his background understood that behind his understated exterior was one of the most scientifically educated members of Congress, but his credentials were largely unknown to the Hollywood audience that had come to see him defeated. Cooper started with broad questions about the urgency of climate action, and the role of government in addressing environmental challenges. Baldoni gave passionate responses about the moral imperative to act immediately, the devastating impacts of climate change on vulnerable communities, and the need for bold leadership that puts the planet ahead of profits. His answers were articulate, emotionally compelling, and perfectly crafted for the audience of environmental activists who filled the auditorium. Massie's responses were characteristically measured and technical. He spoke about the complexity of energy systems, the importance of technological innovation, and the need for policies that could actually be implemented without destroying economic opportunities for working families. His answers were substantive but lacked the emotional appeal that environmental activists expected from climate discussions. For the first 20 minutes, the panel remained within predictable boundaries. Baldoni advocated for immediate dramatic action, while Massie emphasized practical constraints and technological realities. The audience was engaged but not particularly surprised by the familiar liberal versus conservative framework that seemed to be emerging. Then Cooper asked the question that would change everything. Justin, you've been very critical of politicians who you say don't understand climate science. How do you respond to those who argue that Hollywood activists lack the technical expertise to evaluate complex environmental policies? Baldoni's eyes lit up. This was the opening he had been waiting for, the moment he had been preparing for. He was about to demonstrate to this room full of environmental leaders that he understood climate science better than the politicians who were blocking progress, and he was going to use Thomas Massie as his example. Justin Baldoni leaned forward in his chair, his confidence radiating as he prepared to deliver what he believed would be the defining moment of his environmental advocacy career. "Anderson, that's exactly the problem we're facing," he began, his voice carrying the conviction of someone who believed he was about to save the planet through superior knowledge. "We have politicians in Congress, people like Representative Massie here, who consistently vote against environmental protection, who oppose clean energy initiatives, who deny the scientific consensus on climate change, and yet they're the ones making decisions that affect our planet's future." The audience murmured in agreement. This was exactly what they had come to hear, a passionate advocate taking on a climate-denying politician with facts and science. "I may be an actor," Baldoni continued, his voice getting stronger and more confident, "but I've spent years studying climate science. I've read the IPCC reports. I've consulted with leading climatologists. I understand the data, the models, the projections. I know what carbon dioxide does to our atmosphere. I understand feedback loops and tipping points." He turned slightly in his chair, making it clear that his next comments were directed specifically at Massie. "Meanwhile, we have elected officials who vote against every piece of environmental legislation, who take money from fossil fuel companies, and who apparently don't understand even the basic science behind climate change." The room was completely silent. Everyone could feel the tension building. Baldoni was clearly targeting Massie without saying his name directly, but everyone knew exactly who he was talking about. "Let me be specific about what we're dealing with," Baldoni said, his voice now taking on the tone of a teacher lecturing to a particularly difficult student. "Representative Massie has voted against the Paris Climate Accord implementation. He's voted against renewable energy tax credits. He's voted against environmental protection regulations. He's consistently opposed every meaningful action on climate change." Baldoni stood up from his chair, clearly performing for the audience as much as debating his opponent. "These aren't complex policy disagreements. This is basic science denial. When you vote against measures to reduce carbon emissions, when you oppose investments in clean energy, when you support fossil fuel subsidies, you're demonstrating that you simply don't understand how greenhouse gases work." The audience was starting to applaud. Baldoni was delivering exactly the kind of passionate scientific advocacy that environmental activists wanted to hear. He was systematically dismantling a climate-denying politician with facts and logic. "You clearly don't understand the science behind climate change," Baldoni announced, looking directly at Massie with a mixture of confidence and condescension. "Carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. When we burn fossil fuels, we release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide traps heat. More carbon dioxide means more heat. More heat means climate change. This isn't complicated science. This is basic chemistry and physics." The phrase hung in the air like a challenge. Baldoni had just accused a sitting member of Congress of not understanding elementary science, in front of hundreds of environmental leaders, with cameras capturing every moment. But here's what I find most frustrating, Baldoni continued, clearly building toward his knockout punch. When people like Representative Massie oppose climate action, they're not just hurting themselves, they're hurting future generations. They're hurting vulnerable communities who are already suffering from extreme weather events. They're hurting our planet's ecosystems. He walked closer to Massie's chair, his voice becoming more pointed, more personal. So I have to ask, Representative Massie, when you vote against environmental protection, when you oppose renewable energy, when you support fossil fuel subsidies, are you doing it because you don't understand the science? Or are you doing it because you're more concerned about campaign contributions than climate catastrophe? The attack was brutal and direct. Baldoni had just accused Massie of being either scientifically ignorant, or financially corrupt, or both. The audience was riveted. This wasn't just a policy debate anymore. This was a moral reckoning. Anderson Cooper looked visibly uncomfortable. This had gone far beyond typical panel discussion territory into something that felt more like a public trial than a policy conversation. Representative Massie, he said carefully, would you like to respond to those characterizations? For a moment, Massie said nothing. He just sat there, looking at Baldoni, with an expression that could only be described as curious, not angry, not defensive, not even surprised, just curious. Then, slowly, he began to smile, not a political smile, not a defensive smile, the smile of someone who was about to reveal information that would completely change the dynamic of this conversation. Justin, he said quietly, his voice so calm it was almost conversation. I think you might want to check your assumptions before you start questioning other people's understanding of science. Baldoni's confident expression faltered slightly. What do you mean? Massie's smile grew wider. Well, since you brought up scientific credentials and understanding of climate-related technology, maybe we should talk about what each of us actually knows about the subject. What happened next would be replayed on every news channel, environmental blog, and social media platform for months to come. Thomas Massie reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out what looked like a simple smartphone. But this wasn't just any phone. This was about to become the weapon that would destroy Justin Baldoni's credibility forever. Justin, since you want to make this about scientific understanding, Massie said, holding up his phone for everyone to see, let me share some information that might surprise you. His voice was still calm, still conversational, but there was something different about his tone now. Something that suggested Baldoni had just made the biggest mistake of his advocacy career. This phone contains documentation of my educational background, my professional experience, and my actual work on environmental technologies. He continued, looking directly at Baldoni, because you're absolutely right that scientific credentials matter when we're discussing climate policy. Baldoni's face went pale. He was starting to realize that he might have seriously underestimated the man sitting across from him. But it was too late to back down now. Not in front of hundreds of witnesses, not with cameras rolling. Let's start with education, Massie continued, his voice getting stronger, more confident. Justin, you mentioned that you've studied climate science. That's admirable. But I'm curious, what exactly is your educational background in science and engineering? He looked down at his phone, scrolling through what appeared to be research he had done on Baldoni's background. According to your public biography, you studied communications and theater at UCLA. Important subjects, but not exactly the foundation for understanding atmospheric physics or energy systems, engineering. The room was starting to stir uncomfortably. Massie was systematically challenging the credentials that Baldoni had just used to attack him. Now let me share my educational background, Massie said, turning to a different section of his phone. I graduated from Massachusetts Institute of Technology in 1993, with a Bachelor of Science in Electrical Engineering and a Master of Science in Mechanical Engineering. The room erupted in whispers. MIT, electrical and mechanical engineering. This was not what anyone had expected from the congressman they had been told was a science-denying politician. MIT, Massie continued, which is consistently ranked as the #1 engineering school in the world. My coursework included thermodynamics, fluid mechanics, heat transfer, electromagnetic theory, control systems, and energy fervence technologies. But Massie wasn't finished. My master's thesis was on solar energy optimization systems. I designed and built automated solar tracking mechanisms that increased photovoltaic efficiency by 37% compared to fixed-position panels. Baldoni was now visibly sweating. His confident attack on Massie's scientific credentials was being systematically destroyed by actual credentials that far exceeded his own. "But Justin," Massie said, his tone becoming more pointed, "you mentioned understanding how greenhouse gases work. Let me ask you a technical question. Can you explain the specific wavelengths of infrared radiation that carbon dioxide absorbs, and how that relates to atmospheric heating mechanisms?" The question hung in the air like a trap. Baldoni clearly had no idea how to answer it. He had been exposed as someone who could recite talking points, but didn't actually understand the underlying science he claimed to champion. "I can answer that question," Massie continued, not waiting for Baldoni's response. Carbon dioxide primarily absorbs infrared radiation at wavelengths around 4.3 micrometers and 15 micrometers. The 15 micrometer absorption band is particularly important because it overlaps with the peak wavelength of thermal radiation emitted by Earth's surface. The audience was stunned. This wasn't just general knowledge about climate change. This was advanced atmospheric physics being explained by someone who clearly understood the technical details that environmental activists usually only referenced in abstract terms. "But here's what I find interesting about our conversation," Massie said, his voice taking on an almost educational tone. "Justin, you attacked my voting record and suggested that I don't understand climate science, but you haven't actually looked at what I've been working on." He scrolled to another section of his phone. "After graduating from MIT, I founded a technology company that developed energy-efficient building automation systems. We created smart grid technologies that reduced residential energy consumption by up to 40%. I hold multiple patents in renewable energy technologies, including solar panel optimization systems, wind turbine control mechanisms, and battery storage solutions. I've literally invented technologies that reduce carbon emissions." The implications of what Massie was saying were staggering. While Baldoni had been making movies and giving speeches about climate change, Massie had been actually inventing technologies that addressed climate challenges. Massie stood up from his chair, still holding his phone, his confidence growing with every revelation. "Justin, you want to talk about understanding climate science? Let me tell you what I've actually done to address environmental challenges." He began walking across the small stage area, commanding the attention of every person in the room. "On my farm in Kentucky, I've installed a completely off-grid renewable energy system. Solar panels, wind turbines, battery storage, and backup generators that run on methane captured from livestock waste." The audience was completely captivated. This was not the story they had expected to hear from the congressman they had been told was an environmental enemy. "My home produces more renewable energy than it consumes. The excess electricity powers electric vehicle charging stations, greenhouse operations, and water purification systems. I've essentially created a carbon-negative homestead using technologies that I designed and built myself." Massie turned to face Baldoni directly. "Meanwhile, Justin, what have you actually done to reduce carbon emissions? Besides making movies and giving speeches, what tangible technological contributions have you made to solving climate challenges?" The question was devastating because everyone in the room knew the answer. Baldoni was an advocate, not an innovator. He talked about solutions, but he didn't create them. "But let's get to the heart of your criticism," Massie continued, his voice becoming more pointed. "You suggested that I oppose environmental progress because I don't understand science. But my voting record isn't based on scientific ignorance. It's based on engineering analysis." He walked closer to the center of the stage, addressing the entire audience. "When I vote against certain environmental legislation, It's not because I don't believe in climate change. It's because I understand the technical limitations and economic realities that make some proposals impractical or counterproductive. For example, the Green New Deal that you've advocated for includes proposals to retrofit every building in America for energy efficiency within 10 years. As an engineer who has actually designed building automation systems, I can tell you that this timeline is physically epicycle, given current manufacturing capacity and skilled labor availability. Massie's technical analysis was devastating to the environmental movement's preferred policy solutions. He wasn't denying climate science, he was explaining why their solutions wouldn't work. The Green New Deal also calls for eliminating fossil fuels within a decade. But as someone who understands electrical grid engineering, I can tell you that renewable energy storage technology isn't advanced enough to provide reliable baseload power for industrial applications. We need fossil fuels as backup until battery technology improves. He looked directly at Baldoni. So, when you attack politicians like me for opposing certain environmental legislation, you're not attacking climate denial, you're attacking engineering realism. Massie sat back down, but his systematic destruction of Baldoni's credibility was far from over. Justin, you accused me of taking money from fossil fuel companies. Let me address that directly. He pulled up another section on his phone. My campaign finance records are public information. Over 90% of my funding comes from individual donations under $200. I take no money from corporate PACs, including fossil fuel companies. My largest donors are engineers, farmers, and small business owners. Meanwhile, your movies are funded by major entertainment companies that have massive carbon footprints. The film industry generates millions of tons of carbon emissions through production, distribution, and marketing. So I have to ask, are you really concerned about climate change, or are you just using environmental activism to promote your career? The comparison was brutal but undeniable. Massie had exposed the fundamental hypocrisy of Hollywood environmentalism, actors who lecture about carbon emissions while participating in one of the most wasteful industries in the world. And here's what I find most interesting about this conversation, Massie said, his voice taking on a tone of genuine disappointment. Justin, you came here today planning to humiliate me by exposing my supposed ignorance about climate science, but you never bothered to research my actual background or my actual work on environmental technologies. You assumed that because I'm a Republican from Kentucky, I must be scientifically illiterate. You assumed that because I vote against certain environmental legislation, I must not understand climate change. You assumed that because I don't share your political ideology, I must not care about the environment. Massie stood up one final time, addressing the entire audience. This is exactly what's wrong with environmental activism today. Instead of focusing on technological solutions and practical policies, we're focused on political purity and ideological conformity. Instead of working with engineers and scientists to develop better technologies, we're attacking anyone who doesn't support our preferred policies. Instead of building consensus around effective solutions, we're creating divisions based on partisan assumptions. He walked closer to Baldoni's chair. Justin, I hope today has been educational for you. I hope you've learned something about the difference between advocacy and expertise, between passion and knowledge, and between understanding science and just repeating scientific talking points. The silence that followed was profound. Justin Baldoni, the man who had confidently walked onto that stage, planning to expose Thomas Massie as a scientifically ignorant climate denier, sat frozen in his chair, completely destroyed by credentials, patents, and actual environmental achievements that far exceeded his own. Anderson Cooper, clearly sensing that the panel had reached its natural conclusion, tried to move to closing statements, but everyone in the room knew what they had just witnessed. This wasn't just a disagreement about environmental policy. This was a complete paradigm shift in how people think about expertise versus activism, substance versus performance, and solutions versus rhetoric. In less than an hour, Massie had dismantled the entire foundation of Hollywood environmental activism, exposed the gap between talking about science and actually understanding it, and demonstrated why real solutions require real expertise rather than passionate advocacy. The audience knew they had witnessed something historic. As the panel ended and both participants left the stage, The environmental movement was already buzzing with uncomfortable questions. People were pulling out their phones, researching Massie's patents and educational background, discovering his renewable energy innovations, and confirming that everything he had said was verifiably true. The revelations were devastating for the environmental establishment's narrative. Massie did indeed have electrical and mechanical engineering degrees from MIT. He did indeed hold patents in renewable energy technologies. He did indeed operate a carbon-negative farm using his own innovations. He was not a climate denier, he was a climate engineer. Within hours, clips of the confrontation were trending on every social media platform. The hashtag #CheckYourExperts became viral, with millions of people questioning whether their preferred environmental advocates actually understood the science they claimed to champion. Baldoni's attempt to expose Massie's ignorance became a meme, but not in a way that favored environmental activism. Environmental organizations began quietly reaching out to Massie, requesting meetings to discuss his technological innovations and policy insights. Several climate activist groups issued statements acknowledging that they had mischaracterized his positions and background. The entire environmental movement began questioning whether ideological purity was more important than technical expertise. The entertainment industry's response was swift but defensive. Baldoni's representatives tried to control the damage, issuing statements about his continued commitment to environmental advocacy and his respect for scientific expertise. But the documentation was too comprehensive and the contrast too stark for any defense to be effective. Hollywood's environmental community began questioning whether celebrity activism was actually helpful, or whether it was just another form of performance that distracted from real solutions. Many started reaching out to actual scientists and engineers, seeking to understand the technical challenges that their preferred policies faced. But perhaps the most significant impact was on young environmental activists who had watched the confrontation. Millions of college students and recent graduates saw that environmental progress required more than passion and good intentions. It required actual technical knowledge, engineering expertise, and practical understanding of how complex systems actually work. Massie had proven something that the environmental movement had always resisted acknowledging. Real climate solutions come from people who understand how energy systems actually work, not from people who are just passionate about the cause. Technical expertise matters more than political ideology when you're trying to solve engineering problems. Justin Baldoni had walked into that environmental summit, thinking he could destroy Thomas Massie by exposing him as a scientifically ignorant climate denier. Instead, he had accidentally given Massie the perfect platform to demonstrate exactly why Hollywood activism was inadequate for addressing complex technical challenges. The lesson was clear, and it resonated far beyond Beverly Hills. When you challenge someone's scientific credentials, you'd better make sure your own credentials can withstand scrutiny. When you attack someone's understanding of complex technical issues, you'd better make sure you actually understand those issues yourself. Most importantly, when you assume someone is ignorant because of their political positions, you'd better be prepared for them to demonstrate exactly why your assumptions are wrong. Massie had destroyed Baldoni's credibility, not with political arguments or ideological rhetoric, but with degrees, patents, and actual technological innovations that addressed the very problems Baldoni only talked about. The confrontation between Justin Baldoni and Thomas Massie didn't just expose one actor's false claims about scientific expertise, it exposed an entire system of celebrity activism that had substituted passion for knowledge, rhetoric for understanding, and performance for actual problem solving. And in doing so, it accelerated a revolution in environmental advocacy that was already underway, a revolution that values engineering solutions over political positions, technical expertise over celebrity endorsements, and actual innovation over activist rhetoric. Sometimes the most powerful response to passionate ignorance is simply showing your work. Sometimes the best way to defend your positions is by demonstrating your qualifications, and sometimes the most devastating weapon against activist arrogance is just the truth. Baldoni learned the hard way that you should never question someone's scientific expertise without checking your own credentials first. Want to see more moments where arrogant celebrities get completely exposed by real experts? Subscribe right now because we find the most incredible confrontations where fake expertise gets destroyed by genuine knowledge every single day.